Hello, my name is Christopher Smith. I'm very happy to be speaking today. My paper is entitled The Road to the Loft, Urban Dance and Utopian Spaces in the Days Before Disco. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking from North America, from the tribal lands of the Hoosac and Mohican, and I acknowledge the history which has led me to occupy their ancestral homelands. Also a statement about my own positionality. I'm a white, cisgender, male-identifying full professor. I therefore acknowledge systemic privilege, and I vow to employ my privilege for purposes of justice and inclusion. The Stonewall Uprising in June 1969 is now commemorated by the National Park Service as a new watershed in activism within North American gay communities. Particularly in the rise of the Gay Liberation Front and the street activism of ACT UP, Stonewall is seen as a signpost in that historical trend toward LGBTQ rights. Scholarship on the relatively contemporaneous earliest roots of disco likewise describes a utopian space, accepting of fluid racial and gender identities, and situated within the sonic experiments of David Mancuso, the Loft, and analogous dance scenes. But, though rightly understood as foundational to a new transracial and polymorphous vision of dance culture, neither Stonewall nor the Loft were the first essays by gays and lesbians to carve out safer and more inclusive communities, specifically on the dance floor. Indeed, there had been transracial, gay-friendly dance spaces in many immigrant, bohemian, or otherwise fringe neighborhoods in numerous USA cities, especially those which saw large transient populations, including the Tenderloin and West Village in New York, Portland's Lonsdale Square, and Storyville in New Orleans, ever since the early 19th century. But new civil rights activism in the wake of the Second World War, when enlisted persons had the opportunity to discover gay-friendly communities in port cities, dance scenes, often convened in non-traditional spaces like warehouses, private homes, tenements, and outdoor zones, became key components of a new revolutionary consciousness. While advocacy for gay rights expanded in the post-war period with the foundation of the first publicly identified organizations, most notably the West Coast-based Mattachine Society, founded by Harry Hay in Los Angeles in 1948 and 50, and then the Daughters of Bilitis, founded in San Francisco in 1955, the movement, like the women's rights movement, which was catalyzed in roughly the same period, received an influx of strategic and tactical energy from lessons learned by participants in the 60s anti-war and civil rights cohorts. David Mancuso, for example, one pillar as founder of the Loft of this late 1970s rebirth of the dance nightclub, said, quote, "A lot of people were bonding and making relationships because of the Vietnam War and Martin Luther King. There were all the ingredients for a really good soup. I was on the streets and in the party. Dancing and politics were on the same wavelength, and the Loft created a little social progress in tune with the times." End quote. Dance was manifested not only for its capacities for community reinforcement and solidarity, but also as a tool of direct street confrontation and protest. And by and large, the street actions of the late 60s gay rights movement were undertaken by younger people, often working class, persons of color, or other intersectional minorities, who had learned their tactics in the anti-war and hippie communities. On the other hand, establishing environments in which to safely dance together had been a crucial community-building exercise in North American gay culture since, at latest, the 1890s mixed-orientation bars of Bohemian Greenwich Village, and in all likelihood in even earlier mixed-race urban spaces, taverns, concert saloons, brothels, and so forth, which had in fact always been places for behavior which crossed boundaries of race or gender identification. Particularly during Prohibition from 1919 to 1933, speakeasies and private bottle clubs, precisely because of their external need for confidentiality, were for gays relatively safe spaces. There were gay and lesbian clubs and nightclubs throughout the Republic, and we might reference Dale Cockrell's estimates on the number of brothels and thus of musicians in New York City in the period between the Civil War and the First World War. They were often in theatrical districts, and those spaces became locations for music, dance, and sexual exchange, often across boundaries of class and race. In turn, this proximity likewise linked the minoritization of gay men, especially, and black culture. San Francisco's Daughters of Bilitis, however, was founded by 8 women who, quote, initially came together to be able to have a safe space to dance. Even in that tiny initial group consisting of 4 same-sex couples, considerations of precarity, ethnicity, and economic class were present. For example, 4 of the founders were white-collar workers who argued for an organizational mission which included both private social bonding and public civil rights activity. But the other 4, including founder Rose Bamberger, were employed in the working class, and in Rose's case were persons of color. Quote, Rose Bamberger was a young Filipino woman in a relationship with a white woman named Rosemary Sleepin, and Rose really loved to dance. But although San Francisco in the 1950s had a lively gay nightclub scene, same-sex couples could not dance together in public. Additionally, gay bars were subject to police raids, sometimes triggered by undercover cops who posed as gay men or lesbians in order to entrap queer people. Going out to a gay club was dangerous. So Rose had an idea. Why not start a social club for lesbians in which they could gather together in each other's private homes and dance? This would allow them to avoid those police raids. End quote. Spaces in which gender and race-crossing liaisons could be embodied in dance were often located in socially and or geographically marginal places. The alley backhouses of New York, New Orleans, and Washington, D.C., and black and tan clubs like New York's Cotton Club, which specifically catered to a voyeuristic white clientele. Also, the waterfront bars of New Orleans and Cincinnati, as reported by Lafcadio Hearn, and so forth. Just as African Americans had returned from the war far more prepared to confront institutionalized discrimination, gay service people discovered the same sense of a community, particularly in those cities which saw a large influx of civilian workers and enlisted service members during the war. Paradoxically, gay-identified public spaces were very significantly constrained after the end of Prohibition. In New York, for example, the administration of Fiorello LaGuardia clamped down upon gay spaces, especially during the 1939 to 1940 World's Fair, but, quote, raised little objection, though, when gangsters began to underwrite a new network of clandestine and unpretentious gay bars, end quote. This also marked a period in which different circles, mostly ranked by income, began to seek out different locations. For example, those who could afford to vacation on Long Island and Fire Island made those popular gay destinations in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. As Charles Kaiser puts it, quote, in the post-war period, New York City became the literal gay metropolis for hundreds of thousands of immigrants from within and without the United States, the place they chose to learn how to live openly, honestly, and without shame, end quote. The general strategic philosophy of the first post-war organizations like the Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society had been to normalize gay identity. That is, to emphasize the degree to which, with the exception of sexual orientation, gays and lesbians were otherwise like normal other middle-class 1950s Americans. And dance was one core strategy for this. Quote, beginning in 1951, Mattachine began to hold semi-public discussions and same-sex dances, drawing upwards of 300 men and a significantly smaller number of women. By the end of 1952, perhaps as many as 5,000 Californians had participated in Mattachine-sponsored activities, end quote. Those post-World War II social and economic changes had fueled the literary beat movement, whose members, many of them openly gay or bisexual, espoused liberation from normative gender expectations, as they did from other bourgeois values. And these changes would play out even more confrontationally in 1960s hippie culture. The same dynamics obtained in the gay liberation movement, as the Bilitis-Mattachine normalizing strategies were gradually supplanted by more direct confrontational and often theatrical methods. The watershed event commonly described as the public coming of age of this post-civil rights gay liberation movement, whose shift of tactics is remarked not least in the shift of terminology from the intentionally obscure references to Bilitis or Mattachine to ready acceptance of the word gay, is the street confrontation precipitated in June 1970 by an NYPD raid on the Stonewall Inn, a gangster-owned gay-lesbian bar on Christopher Street in New York. The Stonewall, like other gay establishments across North America, was a marginalized space not only because of its marginalized clientele, but also because of the sub rosa opportunism of its organized crime investors. Like the speakeasies in the 1920s and the Cotton Club in 1930s Harlem, the Tijuana Club in 1950s New Orleans, and for that matter a century before, Almac's cellar in 1840s New York, where Dickens saw Master Juba dance. And like the back alley shebeens of 19th century Washington, D.C., the Stonewall's openness to boundary-crossing sexual liaisons resulted from its economic function as a money-laundering operation for organized crime. By the mid-1960s, the bar itself employed an elaborate system of door security, private drag rooms, and warning light signals to minimize the impact of pro forma police raids. However, in this same period, there was among gays and lesbians growing awareness of more aggressive resistance tactics, fueled by the high visibility of actions like the Democratic National Convention in 1968 and the student occupation of Columbia University buildings in that same year. More specifically to the issue of gay and lesbian activity, several West Coast confrontations prefigure the seemingly spontaneous mass resistance at Stonewall. For example, the August 1966 anti-police resistance by transgendered customers at Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco's Tenderloin, and the series of public actions by the newly organized PRIDE, Personal Rights in Defense and Education Advocacy Group, or PRIDE, precipitated by a violent raid on the Black Cat Tavern in December of 1967. Taking into account the accelerating pace and visibility of massed crowd resistance to authoritarian police actions in various contexts, it's therefore ultimately not surprising that eventually similar resistance would arise in New York. Stonewall itself, as an iconic moment of resistance to violent authoritarianism, has entered the canonic history of USA gay rights, and both its details and its semiotic meaning have been well documented. A raid on June 27 of 1969 by a small force of New York police, its particularly aggressive and abusive authoritarian dynamics probably precipitated by tensions between the inn's organized crime owners, corrupt NYPD officers, and the State Alcoholic Beverage Commission, quickly spun out of control. The patrons' seemingly spontaneous resistance, perhaps intensified by the cops' misconduct, began when several of the drag queens and possibly others struck back at the police. At the same time, also in contrast to more usual conduct, those who had escaped arrest did not flee the area when ejected from the inn, but instead gathered in a rapidly expanding crowd outside. They chanted, they began to sing "We Shall Overcome," they threw garbage barrels and beer cans, and they drove the small force of police to barricade themselves inside the inn. Quoting participant Michael Fader, "We all had a collective feeling like we'd had enough of this kind of shit. It wasn't anything tangible anybody said to anybody else. It was just kind of like everything over the years had come to a head on that one particular night in the one particular place, and it was not an organized demonstration. Everyone in the crowd felt that we were never going to go back. It was like the last straw. It was time to reclaim something that had always been taken from us. All kinds of people, all different reasons, but mostly it was total outrage, anger, sorrow, everything combined, and everything just kind of ran its course. It was the police who were doing most of the destruction. We were really trying to get back in and break free. And we felt that we had freedom at last, or freedom to at least show that we demanded freedom. We weren't going to be walking meekly in the night and letting them shove us around. It's like standing your ground for the first time, and in a really strong way, and that's what caught the police by surprise. There was something in the air, freedom a long time overdue, and we're going to fight for it. It took different forms, but the bottom line was, we weren't going to go away, and we didn't." End quote. That small force of cops found themselves besieged inside the bar while the crowd surged back and forth chanting, and by now numbering 500 or 600, literally used battering rams to try to drive in the barricaded doors and free the few remaining arrestees. Sometime after 2:30 a.m. on the morning of June 28, however, the uprising took on certain characteristics which could only have been undertaken by this particular revolutionary subcommunity, and only, in all likelihood, in the wake and awareness of earlier anti-authoritarian protest performativity. Those drag queens who'd either escaped arrest or had been released formed up in the street, and as the paramilitary tactical police force, the ancestors of the SWAT teams, finally arrived to rescue the barricaded cops, the drag queens danced. Quote, "When the police whirled around to reverse direction at one point, they found themselves face to face with their worst nightmare, a chorus line of mocking queens, their arms clasped around each other, kicking their heels in the air Roquette style, and singing at the tops of their sardonic voices, 'We are the Stonewall girls, we wear our hair in curls. We wear no underwear, we show our pubic hair. We wear our dungarees above our nilly knees.'" Sadly, I don't know the tune they sang. This parodic dancing, this playing out in heightened public fashion precisely those body vocabularies which middle-class white authority sought to contain or criminalize, of course has resonances in earlier and more contemporaneous USA resistance movements. Stonewall itself was an early happenstance outbreak, then, of a more revolutionary confrontational consciousness, fueled not least by the working-class precarity of the street kids, racial minorities, and drag queens who were the particular targets and who particularly fought back. Gay political activism would later play out with even greater urgency in response to the AIDS crisis, which initially appeared most widely among populations of urban gay men. ACT UP and like organizations would battle for over a decade to increase medical awareness and to counter government indifference to the scope of the epidemic. But even in the early 1970s, the gains made by political activity in the area of gay rights provided a fertile environment for the enhanced visibility of a nexus of social, racial, and sexual boundary crossing and exchange between black and white, gay and straight communities, which had been part of underground integrated urban settings for literally over a century. Thus, the presence of gays and lesbians, especially white males, in the small bars and private parties wherein late 60s funk and R&B gave birth to both disco-style dancing, when moved to purpose-built nightclubs, but also to the primacy of the DJ and the roots of hip-hop culture. If in the 1950s the main distinguishing characteristics between rhythm and blues and rock and roll were to be found in audience demographics, not musical style, then in the 1970s, the main distinguishing characteristics between disco and prototypical hip-hop were to be found again more in audience demographics than musical style. In the period, Philadelphia and New York were centers of this groove-oriented dance music, whose production and presentation was as much the responsibility of disco record producers and nightclub DJs as it was of the singers and players. In these semi-private dance spaces, David Mancuso's The Loft in Manhattan was permitted to continue operation only after a landmark zoning hearing in which he confirmed that because he was not selling alcohol or food, he could remain open without a nightclub license. The immersive experience of the 1960s hippie dance hall was transmuted into an environment in which nonstop dancing and dancers themselves became the locus of the performance. As Gillian Frank comments, disco placed the bodies of its audience on display. Now, because of the long-standing affinity between homophilic and racially integrated musics and spaces, discos became a common site for gay, especially male, celebration of community. While some scholarship on the gay presence in disco has focused upon the homophobic backlash against such display, I myself am more interested in situating disco's performance of bodily liberation as another manifestation of a long history of dancing revolution. As Frank points out, and as we can better understand, when we recognize the central role of dancing together in the performance of same-sex community, we can see disco as both an idealized group experience, evoking Victor Turner's notion of communitas, and as a celebration of gay public identity in defiance of heteronormativity. Disco, and the rave culture which grows out of its revival in the 1990s, thus became sites for the creation of temporary autonomous zones of freedom, acceptance, equality, and love. Thank you, Marcia. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Stormy. Thank you all very much.